This workshop is designed for undergraduates who are trying to do a literary analysis perhaps for the first time at university. But if you are a postgraduate, you might find it useful as a bit of a refresher. Otherwise, this is targeted towards those who are looking to do perhaps a literary analysis at university for the first time. Okay, so let's get started. Analysing a piece of literature can seem like a pretty daunting task, but generally speaking, literary analysis doesn't have to be that difficult. In fact, it's a lot like analysing anything really. We analyse data in order to make decisions. We might analyse a film in order to decide whether or not we really like it. We analyse reviews of restaurants in order to determine whether or not we'll go there. While literary analysis goes a little deeper than simply deciding whether or not you like something, it is about forming an opinion based on evidence. So once you know how to do this, it's fairly straightforward and it can prove very rewarding. So the following is a 7-step video that will help you start and complete a literary analysis for your essay. It will begin by explaining what a literary analysis is before moving into my own personal suggestions for completing one. Throughout, I'll also give a couple of examples from the work of other students, which will help aid my explanations. So, what is a literary analysis? Literary analysis means analysing a text closely. This means interpreting its given meanings and exploring the literary devices the author has used. It is not a summary of the plot or a review. It is an opportunity for you to explore and analyse a text with a fine-tooth comb, whereby things like character, metaphor, imagery, and language become important clues in regards to making your case. When an author sets out to write a novel or a short story or a play or a poem, they almost always are trying to convey something. It may be that they are exploring the idea of hope or death or loss or whatever. It may be they want to look at the difference between good and evil or what it means to be human. What's important to note here is that very rarely will an author ever flat out say what they are writing about within the text. I mean, why would they? That would sort of take the fun out of it. Instead, authors will subtly weave in the meaning of their work and allow readers to explore and interpret them. Just like a work of art, no piece of literature has one intended meaning. While some stories have very straightforward messages or meanings, such as the parable of the sower, which is the Bible's message being like a seed that grows or doesn't grow within a person, or the story of the boy who cried wolf, which means if you lie, people won't trust you. Or we could look at Ozymandias, the meaning of that poem being power is temporary. Now, other stories are a little more complex, which makes them excellent for analysis. The brilliance of literary analysis is that with the right evidence, any interpretation of the text you have is valid, though this doesn't necessarily mean that all interpretations are good. To analyze a complex work of literature and to make an argument about what it is trying to say requires you to activate a number of important skills that can really help you in life. These include things like critical thinking, writing and expression, as well as empathy. The trick to doing a good literary analysis is to go beyond stating the obvious, to try and reach conclusions that are a little unusual or perhaps haven't been thought of before. It's not always about trying to guess what the author is trying to say and getting it right, because there are multiple ways to interpret a text. Instead, try to form an opinion and use evidence from the text to support it. So, now that we know what a literary analysis is, we can start to look at the steps involved in writing one. Number 1, read the text. Now this is my first rule because it's probably the most obvious, but it's also the most important. It's easy to tell when a student hasn't actually read the text. Your ideas will come across as vague, you'll struggle to provide good evidence to support your assertions. Other times, you'll pick small portions of the text that don't really speak for the whole text and then assume this is what the overall story is trying to say. Reading the text is crucial to being able to form a solid opinion. Now, while literary analysis involves having an opinion and substantiating that opinion with good evidence, not all opinions are equal. For example, if you were to say that Finding Nemo was all about escapism, thinking, of the scene at the dentist, that would be a poor analysis because escape doesn't really appear elsewhere in the text. The best thing you can do in order to improve your analysis is to actually read all of the text. Number 2, take notes. While reading the text, you want to be taking good notes. This means highlighting certain scenes you think are relevant or interesting, noting down quotes that speak to a particular theme, or just jotting down your thoughts on what the author might be trying to say. You might think that as you're reading, you'll recall all the interesting elements that your brain has picked up on, but the truth is you won't. So you need to be taking notes and keeping quotes that you find interesting and that you think might be useful for your essay. Now, how do you decide if a quote is interesting or worth noting down? Well, it's really up to you. Does the quote make you think about a particular idea or a theme? Does the quote make you ponder your own existence? Does the quote just sound good? It doesn't really matter. If it's interesting, it's probably worth noting down. To save time, you might want to consider quotes that speak to the question you're trying to address or that solve the problem that you're trying to solve. Ideally, you'll read the text more than once, though sometimes this isn't always possible. If you can, on your first reading, you should be trying to experience it as it's meant to be experienced, i.e. as a form of entertainment. In the second reading, if you're able to, once you have experienced the text, you can then start to note down your ideas about it. Doing this is not only helpful for your analysis, it also ensures the text is not ruined from having analysed it, though fair warning, this can happen. Though I would argue any text I've analysed on my own after high school has made the text more enjoyable. Number 3, form opinions. Now that you've read the text, you should be starting to form some opinions concerning the themes and ideas behind it. Remember, when doing a literary analysis, there's no single or correct way to view and analyse a text. That's what makes it so interesting. Though some opinions are better than others. For example, if your opinion of Finding Nemo is that it's about a fish that gets lost and tries to find his dad, then you haven't really said anything of merit. You're simply recalling the plot. Good literary analysis attempts to provide opinion to the text based on evidence that are a little more nuanced and complex. For example, take a look at this student's response to Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. Now, this is by no means perfect, though the student did score high marks for their response. Note that they could have used more specific examples, but nonetheless they've done well to form a nuanced opinion based on sufficient evidence from the text. They've also managed to use the opinions of others in order to help bolster their opinion of the text, which we'll explore in one of the following steps. Number 4, look for themes. One of the most important aspects of a literary analysis is spotting recurring themes or ideas within a text. While some themes may not have been the author's intention, it's okay to mention them. Some overarching themes include death, as in the play Hamlet, good versus evil in Star Wars, coming of age and the loss of innocence in Stand By Me, or in Finding Nemo, the main theme of that film is the idea of trust, and more specifically, the idea of in order to truly love someone, sometimes we have to let them go. Although you'll want to try and distinguish between what the author has intended and what you have inferred or suggested, we never truly know what an author is trying to do, even if they flat out say what their intentions were. We should then always look at patterns or recurring ideas that speak to or relate back to an overarching theme. Most good works of literature have these themes or ideas and will use characters, plot, imagery, metaphor, and other literary devices in order to highlight what the author is trying to say, while often avoiding stating this directly. We'll discuss more of why this is so in point 6. Often, themes will arise in how the character narrator feels about the situation, or the events occurring in the story. This emotion can come through in the way of setting, objects, and how the world is described. For example, in the poem Ozymandias, a character describes an ancient statue in the desert, stating, "Half sunk a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read." The shattered visage and the wrinkled lip, as well as the sneer, infer certain meanings and speak to themes of power, more specifically that power is temporary or fleeting. Now, the message in Ozymandias is notoriously straightforward. Note that the text you are analysing might not have such a clear and straightforward meaning. You might have to dig a little deeper in order to determine what the text is actually about. In some cases, you might be given an essay topic, in which case it might not be best to discuss the text's main or overarching themes. Instead, you might want to choose the themes that best relate to the question. It's also completely fine to make up themes that you think might be in the text, but it's important that you evidence these with excerpts. In a literary analysis, evidence might look like a quote from the text, an excerpt of one of the scenes, a line of poetry, or an example of one of the literary devices the author has used. Number 5. Keep a list of quotes and scenes. While reading the text, you'll want to record any quotes or scenes that you think are interesting or useful. This means recording quotes that may help answer the question or support a point you're trying to make. Alternatively, if you come across a quote or particular passage that you find interesting, note that down. If you sense there might be something more to a particular scene or aren't sure, note that down as well. You can usually tell what parts of Shakespeare are important when a particular character speaks for a lengthy amount of time. There is usually a reason behind their lengthy spiel. Often, the same occurs in films or novels. Whenever the character speaks for an extended amount of time in a piece of dialogue, the author is usually trying to say something within that monologue. Now realize that the brain will not remember these quotes upon first seeing them, so be sure to note them down when you first come across them. This means doing more than simply earmarking the page, as you'll often forget why you earmarked the page in the first place. Depending on the length of your analysis, it may be better to do handwritten or electronic notes. E-notes are easier to sort through, though writing your own handwritten notes can prove useful when trying to retain certain information. Number 6. The text is your evidence. When doing a literary analysis, it's important to remember that the text is going to be your evidence. You use the text to support your answer. You may also use additional supporting evidence, for example, other authors, scholars, or critics. However, it is important to draw from the text itself as well. This means using quotes with page numbers and in-text citations. You can use longer block quotes in a literary analysis, i.e. quotes that are more than 3 lines long, but try not to overdo it in a shorter essay. If you can, shorten your quotes using ellipses. This allows you to get rid of portions of the text that aren't important or that don't speak to the theme that you're addressing. It's also important to note here that while you want to use the text as evidence, don't end your paragraphs with quotes from the text. This is what we call a hanging quote. It's not helpful as it leaves the quote unexplored and the reader left wondering why it's relevant. Always make sure to offer an interpretation of the quote you're using. Try to give an explanation of why you've included it. Don't just let the reader assume or try to make sense of why it's there. In this example, the student has used a particular scene from the book Alice's Adventures in Wonderland to demonstrate how Carol critiques Victorian society. You might want to pause the video here and have a read of what the student's written. Now, while improvements could have been made, this example does illustrate how examples from the text are very important, as they help provide evidence to support the student's ideas. Note the mention of Alice's exclamation, "You're nothing but a pack of cards." This is an important quote that demonstrates the student's point, which is that Lewis Carroll is critiquing Victorian upper middle class society, and that this is a rite of passage moment for Alice. So to reiterate, remember to use the text as evidence to support your ideas. Often students just go about finding the opinions of scholars and using those in their essays, but it's important to use quotes, excerpts, and examples of literary devices that the authors have used. Number 7. Explore the perspective of others. While you want to be forming your own opinions of the text, it's also important to consider the opinions of others. This means going and doing some research of academic articles and looking at the various perspectives out there. What have others said about the text? Do you agree with them? Do they agree with you? What have they said that you perhaps don't agree with? This will form an important part of your analysis, which, when put alongside your own opinions with examples from the text, will bolster your response. Again, the same goes with using the perspective of others as it does with using quotes from the text. Avoid ending paragraphs on quotes. You'll confuse your reader and you'll lose marks. Instead, try to say something about why the quote is there or why it's relevant. How does it help answer the question, and how does it relate to your thesis? Now, that brings us to the end of the 7-step process. There are many other factors to a literary analysis that I haven't discussed. These include things like the author's personal, social, and historical context. Often these factors impact how a text is written and provide useful commentary that can inform your analysis, so be sure to consider these when doing your own analysis of a text. And remember, there's no perfect formula for writing an analysis. It's really about forming a solid understanding, having an opinion, and substantiating that with evidence in order to answer a question. Now, it always helps to have a second pair of eyes look over your work, so feel free to book a consult with an academic learning facilitator at the Learning Hub.